We're starting a new video series on this channel today. It is the history of Gallifrey. Yes, the Doctor's home planet, the seat of power of the Time Lords. Unlike the story of the Eighth Doctor, which I'm going through sequentially bit by bit over the course of a few years, this I am going to piece together over the course of a few years out of order. It'll be kind of like the Star Wars movies in that regard. A couple pieces here, a couple pieces there, and eventually the whole thing will be assembled. The reason originally, I was just going to do like series reviews of the Gallifrey spin-off series by Big Finish Productions because they're awesome, and I just want to, tell more people about them because they're good. We should go listen to them and stuff. But with the appearance of Gallifrey on the new television show, Series 12 here, with the 13th Doctor, and seeing goodness knows what's happened, what the Master's done to Gallifrey now, I thought it would be a better idea to spread out the scope of this series to be about all of Gallifrey, not just the Big Finish spin-off series. Nevertheless, we're starting with what corresponds to Big Finish Gallifrey spin-off series 1, 2, and 3. So this is episode 6 of the history of Gallifrey, and we're looking at a period of time when the Lady Romana Varatrelundar is the president, and how she got there, and who K9 and the other main characters are. Some of that relies upon you having known a couple of these characters from the television series, and this is the middle of the story in a way. But this is a good place to begin. It's the beginning of the spin-off series, and it's a fun era to follow in the history of Gallifrey. So our main characters, our absolute main characters at this point, the ones that you know from classic Doctor Who: Romana, this is the second Romana, played by Lalla Ward, and Leela, the huntress, the savage. Both of these characters traveled with the Fourth Doctor, and Leela, he had left on Gallifrey because she fell in love with one of the Chancellor Guards, and Romana, he left in E-Space, but in a couple novels she made her way back to Gallifrey eventually and became president, so that's fun. And both of them have an iteration of the robot dog K9 with them. So we have K9 Mark 1 and K9 Mark 2, Leela and Romana. What we get here in the series of Gallifrey, we get a bunch of new characters and some very interesting plots going on. Some of the creators of this series described it as a science fiction version of West Wing. Just a sort of political thriller, and mixed in with all this time travel and technological stuff, because it's the Time Lords. You can't do a Time Lord story without time travel. So Gallifrey Series 1 is very plotty. It's full of ideas, it's full of concepts, and new ideas and alien races and situations are being introduced. We're introduced to the Temporal Powers, which is basically a loose coalition of races in our galaxy that have time travel capabilities. Not necessarily limited to our galaxy, I suppose. So the Time Lords are unquestionably the most powerful, and they have basically a sort of hegemony over the time vortex. So that is a sense, or a source of contention, obviously. You can imagine these various other races, particularly the Monin host, are a little uncomfortable with the Time Lords lording over them. And as we come up through this first series, we discover something called the Free Time Movement, which, if you uncapitalize it, free time, it sounds really silly, but it's taken seriously enough that you sort of go along with it in these stories. Series 1 has 4 stories in it, Weapon of Choice, Square One, The Inquiry, and something else. I forget the title. Good job, Matt. So what we are going through here is we're starting with this sort of threat, this terrorist threat, basically, a timonic fusion device. It's this weapon of doubtful existence. Where did it come from? Is it real? And apparently someone has stolen it from Gallifrey's fairly recent history, and so the leadership is scrambling to get it back. And it may or may not have, actually been stolen and threatened, but, what's going on? It's a bit of a opener story, really. The second story then turns to a peace conference looking at the different, temporal powers, and someone is manipulating the conference. They've stuck it in a time loop in the hopes that if they just repeat it enough times, the desired outcome will be reached. And there's a fun reveal at the end of that story where Romana has actually been doing a real peace conference with the actual leaders of the other powers, and this was just a front to attract all the terrorists. So that was kind of fun. You start seeing the devious plottings, not just by corrupt politicians, but by Romana herself, the Lady President. Then we get to an inquiry. The Inquisitor from Trial of a Time Lord back in the 1980s is brought back, and she plays the same character the actress is brought back, plays the same character. She now has a name this time, Darko, and she is running an inquiry. Sorry, English versus American accents are weird. An inquiry or an inquiry. She is trying to, lead this discussion and investigation. Was the timonic fusion device real? Did it ever exist? Who actually made it? Where did it come from? Where did it go? Was the intervention in the first story legitimate, or was it just an abuse of the president's power? So you begin to see factions that don't want Romana in power, because Romana is sort of the classic peaceful liberal sort of character. She wants Gallifrey to be peaceful. It's always been peaceful, but she wants them to be friendly and more open with the other temporal powers. She's not really so much the isolationist. She wants Gallifrey a bit more involved. And, this comes from her experience as a traveler. Her time with the Doctor and her time after the Doctor, just traveling and exploring the universes and, seeing that Gallifrey can make a difference for good. So that's what she's after, and a lot of people are not so happy about this. They want them to hang on to their power, hang on to them, to their, uniqueness, and hold all those lesser races at bay. The fourth and final story of Series 1, it feels like a bit of an unrelated diversion, because all of a sudden there's something going on with Cecilia Pollard, who is the sister of Charlotte Pollard. This was a companion of the Eighth Doctor, which Leela and Romana met briefly in a previous story before this series takes place. And it turns out someone's been manipulating her timeline and messing around on 1920s Earth. So there's some pretty bizarre stuff going on. And again, you have some rewriting of time, some multiple time tracks sort of going off the rails from each other, and dealing with all this timey-wimey stuff, as Stephen Moffat would say. We also get to find out what happened to Leela's late husband, Andred, which was one of the questions and mysteries going through these stories. And finally, we get to know more about the timonic fusion device. So this is kind of fun. Series 2 gets a little less complicated with the plots and focuses more on characters. And this is where you start to get to know some new folks, or renewed folks, depending on what you've read or listened to before. The two new characters that you get to see a lot are Braxiatel, who was introduced in some of the Seventh Doctor novels way back in the 90s, and also Narvin, who is the coordinator of the CIA. That's the Celestial Intervention Agency. And now we also get in Series 2 some backstory of Romana. We get the introduction or the explanation of why she regenerated kind of randomly after the Key to Time quest. And some interesting stuff about Gallifrey's own history as well. We're introduced to this idea of the Imperiatrix. Apparently, many centuries ago, Pandora was a Lady President of Gallifrey, and she aspired to become the Imperiatrix. She was defeated, but her mind, like all Time Lords, lives on in the Matrix, and she has been trying to re-manifest herself. And finally, in the House of Heartshaven, Romana is born, and she is the chosen vessel to bring Pandora back into the world. Apparently, Braxiatel was Romana's tutor way back when, and he found out about this. He blocked Pandora from Romana's mind, and then, when stuff happened in the Key to Time stories, apparently that was unlocked in Romana's mind, and so she regenerated to scramble Pandora away again. So, interesting stuff. It's a nice, retcon of sorts. We'll fill in the gaps for her backstory. But of course, then that becomes a major theme for Series 2, this rise of Pandora as she tries to manifest herself. And what's really fun about this is that we get to see Mary Tam come back as the first Romana. At first as just a sort of Matrix projection of herself, but eventually Pandora manifests herself using the body of the first Romana. So we get Mary Tam versus Lalla Ward, the two Romanas, except only one of them is real. So that's a lot of fun, and you get this sort of crazy stuff going on as it builds over time. A lot of mysteries. Again, some Time Lord trickery as someone later on in this series travels back in time, shows up in episode 2, and no one knows who he is and what happens, but they know that something is wrong, so they're trying to figure out what's going on in the future before they get there. It all ties together really well. There's also a bit of almost cliche stuff going on in Series 2 of Gallifrey. Leela and Romana are very, very different characters. Romana, of course, is very intelligent, very logical. She's a genius. And Leela is a person of instinct. She knows how to hunt. She knows how to survive in the wild. She doesn't understand half of what the Time Lords say, and she is not at all comfortable with the fact that they never really speak straightly anyway, even when they're not being science-y. So they're very, very different characters. And so there's this one story where they are on a vacation planet, basically, and they're just spending time relaxing in each other's styles and ways and getting to know each other, and it's a bonding experience. So cliche, but it's kind of fun because they're very different people, and you can tell that they work together well and they're a great foil for one another, but it's the building of a friendship over the course of time, so that is fun. And they are basically the mainstay of the Gallifrey spin-off series. For almost every single series of Gallifrey. Maybe in the Time War stuff we'll get to something different, but I haven't even listened to those yet, so don't worry about it. As we go through the course of Series 2, there's all this stuff about Pandora trying to manifest herself and all these crazy things going on, and finally she does manifest, as I said, in the person of the first Romana, and there she is just before Darko gets herself elected president. It's a whole mess, and suddenly Pandora is here to become the Imperiatrix, as Romana attempted to seize power to stop her. So it's a big mess, and a big cliffhanger ending as Romana is thrown into prison. Series 3 picks right up where that leaves off with its 5 stories and deals with this fractured Gallifrey. Well, actually, in a fractured Romana as well, because Romana 1 and 2 are sort of a time paradox. So they're both sort of fading until one is destroyed. And that's kind of a good source of tension for this part of the series. You get the second story where they're just in all-out war and they're trying to destroy each other. Eventually, Romana has to destroy the Matrix in order to destroy Pandora completely. So it gets pretty intense, and the fallout for Gallifrey is pretty crazy. And that all wraps up a lot more quickly than you expect, because there are more things that have to play out in Series 3. We get to know Narvin better, the coordinator of the CIA. And one of the big things going on is that Darkle, the Inquisitor, wants to become president, and she's trying to get Narvin on her side because she knows Narvin hates Romana as president. Narvin is an old school guy. He wants Gallifrey to be its own thing, and don't worry about the other alien races out there. Just leave them alone. But we begin to see in this series that Narvin isn't really loyal to Darkle either. He's loyal to Gallifrey. He's loyal to whoever the president happens to be at the time, which means he's loyal to Romana. Mostly. So he's a very interesting character, the smooth talker and very like all wars are political kind of guy. And it's very, very tricky. And it's hard to guess what's going to happen. Just all this stuff going on. And finally, it comes to a head. Pandora, the last vestige of her, is found to be trapped. Not in Braxiatel's mind, as we're led to think early on, but actually in Darkle. So when Darkle makes Braxiatel lose his concentration, Darkle is the one who's destroyed. And it's called a mind bomb in the last, or second to last story of this section. But then everything falls apart at the end. The Free Time virus is released. So this is a link back to Series 1 of the Gallifrey spin-off series. Free Time is a movement that wants to open up the time vortex for everyone equally. It end the Time Lord hegemony and just let all the temporal powers work on an equal level, rather than having to go through Time Lord supervision and so forth. One of the threats early on, besides the Timonic fusion device, was this Free Time virus, which supposedly would make a Time Lord rabidly loyal to the Free Time cause. But it doesn't take effect right away. It infects you invisibly, but it doesn't take effect until you regenerate. So it could infiltrate a massive proportion of the Time Lord population before anyone even knows about it. But finally, at the end of Series 3, there's a breakout of it, and it starts to happen. And they figure out, all right, how do we can cure this? But it means preventing all Time Lords from regenerating at all. In other words, the Time Lords will no longer be Time Lords, they'll be ordinary mortals. And in a way, that's the whole point of the Free Time virus. So that's a big mess. And, things are just going crazy. The Gallifreyan economy collapses because apparently they have an economy. And everyone is, the leadership is desperate to get this cure. Romana is out of power. She can't reclaim the presidency. Braxiatel's in there. He's got someone else as the president. It's a big, crazy mess. And finally, at the last minute, instead of saving the day, Braxiatel snatches up the entire contents of the Matrix and the biodata of all Time Lords, takes Romana and Leela and Narvin away, and they just go off and hide. And that's where Gallifrey Series 3 ends. So the devastatingly awful result of all this is just what happened with I guess in a way, this is the result of Romana's presidency. She's there, she tried to do good, and all the wheeling and dealing around just tore the planet apart. And then it ends up ravaged by a virus, and people are being zombified by it, and they're stuck with a president who just doesn't know what to do, and he is stuck. So this is a dark chapter of Gallifreyan history. It's a fun place to start, I guess, but we'll hear more about it in other videos. But basically, in the final picture here, this chapter of Gallifreyan history, we see the push towards reform, the push towards openness, or liberalism, if you want to call it that, and the pushback and the people that are brought in along the way to try and stop Romana's program just results in war, destruction, and death. And Gallifrey is presumably basically destroyed at this point. I mean, it's physically there, and the population is expected to have some survivors, but they're kind of already gone. Now, outside of universe, this was all written before the Time War was introduced in New Who on TV. So this was all just background stuff just happening with Big Finish stories before the new series was any awareness. So once the new series talks about the Time War and the destruction of Gallifrey by the Doctor and the war with the Daleks, okay, well, I guess maybe we should have more stories about Gallifrey to get them out of this pickle so they can end up in the other one where the Doctor destroys them. So that's why we get more Gallifrey stories by Big Finish. But this one here, this chapter 6 with, or episode 6 of the story of Gallifrey with this, the presidency of Romana, is a neat picture of how Gallifrey goes from this strong, virtually uncontested power all the way down to this virtual ruinous collapse. So yes, a sad time in the history of Gallifrey, but by no means the last. Good luck till next time. We'll have to see what happens next.